Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming September of 2017 premiere auction. And what we have today is an M14. Well, no, it's not actually quite an M14, but it looks a lot like an M14. It's in 308. However, it says X26 back here and E.G. Reising. And when you start looking closer, you realize that the handle's not quite right, this isn't quite right, the sight's definitely not an M14 sight. So what is this thing? Well, this is an experiment to adapt the Reising submachine gun action to a 308 or 7.62 NATO caliber self-loading rifle. Now, the Reising as a submachine gun was a little bit unusual because it actually had basically a locked-breech system. The bolt actually tilted up into the back of the receiver to lock. Now, in the Reising, this was really more of a delayed blowback system than a physical locked system. However, it's a type of mechanism that would be very easily converted into a true locked breech, and that's what they've done here. Eugene Reising is the guy who was obviously the designer of the Reising submachine gun. He was quite the talented engineer and firearms designer. He worked with a whole bunch of different gun companies, big names you recognize, Marlin, Mossberg, Savage, Colt. While working for Colt, he was actually an assistant to John Browning, had a hand in the refinement and development of the 1911 pistol. He knew what he was doing. And the submachine gun that he put together, it kind of got a bad reputation in World War II, but for reasons that weren't entirely its own fault. Primarily that it didn't have universal parts interchangeability. Well, it hadn't actually been designed to, and in order to put it into production for World War II, they built it the way it currently was. So the guns worked great unless you started mixing and matching parts, and then you could have problems. Well, nobody told the Marines, they started mixing and matching parts, and then they had problems. Anyway, in the 1950s, after World War II, the market for the Reising submachine gun started to diminish. So the gun was offered in semi-automatic forms, it was offered as a police submachine gun, and it was actually pretty well suited to that role. But by 1957, these things were starting to come off the market. They just weren't selling very well anymore. And at that point, it appears that Reising made a couple of experimental guns like this one, just to see if he could adapt the system to the new style of combat rifle that the Army was using. Now, Reising had a long-going relationship with the Harrington and Richardson Company. H&R had been the factory that produced his Reising submachine guns for the military. He designed them, he got a royalty from H&R and licensed them to manufacture the guns. So at about this time, H&R was actually manufacturing a .22 caliber, what they called a simulator, of the M14 rifle. It was basically the same length and weight and setup as the M14, but fired .22 rimfire cartridges. In fact, Reising had been the one primarily who designed it. And that layout, I think this is actually basically a stock from one of those .22 caliber simulators. And Reising basically took front-end bits from an M14. This has the gas system of an M14, the handguard of an M14, and then a tubular receiver much more along the lines of a Reising submachine gun. So let me pull the stock off and let's take a closer look at what we can see inside it. The action is obviously the most interesting part of this. And when I pull the bolt handle back, you'll see that this is very much a Reising style of system. You can see the bolt drop right there. That's out of battery, that's locked into battery, and then cycles back and locks up, ready to fire. The trigger guard here is far simpler than what you would get on an M14. I don't have one of H&R's .22 simulators to compare to, but I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that this is the same trigger guard that was used on those .22s. It does have a safety very similar to that of the M1 Garand and M14. And then this thing's just screwed into the wood. We have a control lever here on the right side, which is S for semi and A for fully automatic. This is a machine gun, and in full auto it does actually fire in full auto, or at least it cycles in full auto. The rear sight is a two-position flip aperture sight, like so. Simple, but effective. There's our serial number on the top of the receiver, X26, and a clearly hand-stamped E.G. Reising mark on the back of the receiver. So one would presume that this was actually a hand-built gun by Eugene Reising. Also interesting, on the left side of the receiver at the back is what apparently was the early version of the safety with fire and safe, and a cutout in the wood for a lever there, but that cutout has been plugged, and the safety was replaced with an M1 Garand style safety. Unfortunately, the magazine is missing from this example, and it does not appear to fit a standard M14 magazine, so I don't have that to show you. However, by removing this screw, I can take off the stock, and then we can get a much better look at the inside. With that screw out, you do have to have the safety engaged, and then the stock just lifts nicely off the action. Now this bottom assembly, magazine well and trigger assembly, is aluminum, where the rest of the gun is steel, which is kind of interesting. Unfortunately, the pins holding this bottom assembly in place pretty well peened in place, so I can't take this off to show you in greater detail. However, we can see what's going on here. Obviously, the bolt is attached to this operating rod. That operating rod is connected out here. We have a recoil spring in the middle, and the rod comes out to this point where it is impinged upon by a standard M14 gas piston. So this is a design that was clearly made after the M14 was fully in production. This wasn't a military experiment or something submitted prior to the M14 adoption, because we have all of these standard M14 parts that are being used on it. It actually makes really good sense with the timeline of the end of commercial sales of the Reising submachine guns and the H&R development of this 22 caliber M14 simulator, all going along with developing as an experimental version of the Reising in 308. Once we take this gas plug out, we then have a short stroke gas piston right in there. This is standard M14 parts. The way this piston works is that gas actually comes out through the gas block here, in here, out the front of the piston, where it then impinges. This would be sitting right about like this. The plug is in there. When this thing starts pushing gas out the front of the piston, that pushes it backwards, which pushes on the operating rod here, which cycles the action. There are a couple interesting things we can see at the back here. First off, there are the two positioning notches for the original safety at the back left of the receiver. This is our disconnector. So when you're cycling the action, you can see that the operating rod bar here is going to push this disconnector down, like so. And when it is in the down position, if you pull the trigger, take the safety off, when this is in the downward position and you pull the trigger, nothing happens. The actual trip for the sear is this rectangular block right here. And that will only be pushed on if this disconnector is in the upward position. Then once it fires and is still in the upward position, when the gun cycles, the op rod pushes it back down and resets it. Notice how I have the sear all the way forward here. And when I cycle the op rod, that disconnector is going to drop, which releases the sear, which means I have to reset the trigger in order to fire a second time. You can also see the hammer in here, which is a traditional style of hammer. The original Reising submachine guns had like a cylindrical linear hammer instead of this type. So Reising redesigned the fire mechanism substantially for this 308 locked breech version of the gun. The catch for the safety is really quite simple. It's just this little flat spring that the safety flips over that little V notch in it to stay in one position or the other. One more view of the underside of the receiver when it cycles. Not a whole lot else going on there. This is actually a pretty simple system. We have a tilting bolt, we have a gas piston operating mechanism, and we have a pretty simple hammer firing system. As you might expect, given that nobody's ever heard of these things really, and the serial number has an X and only 2 digits, this did not prove successful. Now, I don't have any documentation of military testing. I don't know that it actually went to military testing. I suspect it did not. I suspect that H&R and Reising were testing out this concept and decided that it wasn't suitable. And exactly why, I can only speculate. I'll tell you what, the amount of locking surface in this thing doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence for me. Maybe it worked fine. Honestly, the HK-G3 locking recesses don't inspire a whole lot of confidence either when you start looking at them closely, but that gun works just fine. So we can only speculate as to why this never went into production, but we do know for a fact that it did not go into production. So there is one of these documented in basically the one book out there on the Reising submachine gun. I don't know if it's this exact same gun or not, but it's clearly the same design. So if you would like to have this one in your own collection, if you are interested in Reising's or H&R or US Cold War firearms designs, well, it's a pretty interesting one. Certainly not very many of these out there. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on this piece. You can see their pictures, their description, their price estimates, all that good stuff. And if you're interested in bidding, you can do so over the phone, over the website, or live at the auction in person. Thanks for watching.